A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Here's a question for you. How can we let the Bible speak rather than reading into it our own modern thinking, our own modern interpretations? Well, have you ever heard someone say you can manipulate the Bible to say whatever you want it to? Well, let's turn our attention to some tools that we might need for understanding the Bible and letting the Bible speak without our biases getting in the way. Some will argue, I don't need anything except the Bible. Well, others will say, everything in the Bible has a context, and it's helpful to understand the text if I know something about whether it's telling a story or it's written as a letter or written as history or contains some symbols that need some extra insight. Well, Andy Judd is back with us. He's a lecturer in Old Testament at Ridley College in Melbourne. He's the author of the book called Modern Genre Theory. Hey, Andy, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thank you, Neil. Always happy to talk about the Bible with you.
It is true, isn't it, Andy, that God can speak through the Bible whether you understand the context or not? What are your thoughts?
Look, God spoke through a donkey in the story of Balaam, so I'm sure he can, God is very good at communicating. He's good at getting his words across. But as people who love the Bible and want to get as much out of it as possible, I don't think that should make us lazy. I think we should try our best to hear what's being said in the original context and to apply it. But yeah, sure. I mean, God can get his word across. But I think the responsibility on us is to listen as well as we can and not let our preconceptions get in the way of our reading of the Bible. It's more fun that way too, because the Bible, it's a wild ride sometimes, as you know, Neil, and your listeners will be aware. There is a lot of beauty in there. There's a lot of challenging text in there. You can spend your lifetime reading it and not get bored.
Sometimes we'll open the Bible and say, this must be a 21st century book. What's it saying to me in the way that I understand the world? I know you occasionally talk about things like a gap between what people thought in the first century, or even going back longer into the Old Testament, and what people think today. Of course, we think differently. How do you explain that to people when you talk about a gap?
On day one, when my students start their course, I often say to them that reading the Bible is like visiting a foreign country. And as anyone who knows, who's visited another country, you get off the plane and there can be an experience of culture shock. You know, you experience that the people are eating strange food and they're driving on the wrong side of the road, and sometimes they speak another language. And the key thing as a traveller, as a good traveller, is not to jump to conclusions about that place, but to slow down and ask questions and be aware of your own cultural background coming into play. Now, overseas travel is expensive, Neil, as you know. Not all of us can afford to go overseas very much, but you can pick up the Bible for free and be transported to a distant time and a distant place, another culture. Now, there's still humans there. There's still people. We still have a huge amount in common, and God is still talking to us through the message that was first heard in that foreign place. But it just takes a little bit of curiosity. It takes a little bit of good traveling in order to understand what's going on. And that's my encouragement to anyone who wants to read the Bible. Be a good traveler. Ask questions, slow down, and be aware that we all come from a culture and a cultural background which seems normal to me. I mean, you might have an accent, Neil, but I don't have an accent. I just talk normally, right? We're all prone to being unself-aware. So let's be self-aware. Let's be good travelers.
Let's talk about the authority that you have when you write about genres and, you know, like being in a foreign country. Well, the Bible's made up of a whole lot of different genres, and we might be able to identify, you know, the books of the law or wisdom literature if we're thinking about Proverbs. We might be able to identify the epistles in the New Testament, and there's some things that are historic. When we're talking about those genres, those are the things that help us to enculturate. Is that the case? You know, putting yourself back into the Bible's history to understand what the writer was meaning.
That's right. What was this writer doing? Like, what's the game they're playing? Every genre which we write or read in has certain rules and certain customs. They're conventions, if you like. And some countries we drive on the right side of the road. Some countries we drive on the left side of the road. Every culture does communication differently, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. We just have to be aware that the conventions might change. A very silly example, which nothing hinges on this, but we write the recipient of a letter at the start of the letter and the author at the end of a letter when we're writing a letter to a friend. Whereas in the ancient world, Paul starts his letters with his name. That's not because the letter's to him, it's because that's the way that they write letters in the ancient world. And we know that because there's a huge treasure trove of ancient papyri letters which have been found and been translated, which you can read online for free, which are just everyday letters. Dear Mum, I crashed the chariot, please send money, right? Those kind of things. Or dear Neil, here's my invoice for the olive oil that you sold, but your price for peanuts is too high, or whatever. We have all these letters, so we know what the conventions were, and sometimes they really help us to get context for understanding what the biblical writers were doing when they decided to write a letter. Now, it's not totally different to how we write letters, but it is worth being aware that this is a particular genre with a particular purpose and a particular form.
Sometimes when we have our version of the Bible, oftentimes there'll be an introduction at the beginning of each book or letter. Those are obviously valuable when you're reading, but when you talk about genres, you're just taking things just that little bit deeper, aren't you? And saying, when you talk about the genre in this particular book, there might be a whole lot of different genres in there. You're helping people understand more deeply how they can interpret what they're reading.
Absolutely, and what you're meant to do with it as well. So a silly example, in my class I'll say, well, everyone thinks you should do what the Apostle Paul says in his letters. Absolutely. We're serious Christians here. We should obey the word of God. Absolutely, hands up, agree. Okay, well, St. Paul says that you need to bring his cloak and his scrolls next time you see him. So hands up here if you've brought along some scrolls and a cloak for the Apostle Paul. Yeah. And of course, no one puts up their hand. I think, what backsliding Christians we are. We're not even taking the word of God seriously when Paul instructs us in a command to bring the scrolls and his cloak. For those who don't know, that's a reference to part of one of Paul's letters where he has a little, he signs off and he asks the recipient to does some travel arrangements in his letter. Now, it's a silly point, but the point is, it's a silly example, but an important point. These are letters, which means they're written by someone into a particular occasion. Right? You don't just write a letter for no reason. You write a letter to a particular person for a particular purpose in that time for that reason. And it's the word of God to us. We need to apply them and put them into practice. But part of doing that is to realize that these were written first into a particular occasion, and from that we can conclude things about the general, theological principles or how we should live our life. But we can't do that until we've understood what situation was Paul addressing. So, for instance, when one of the letters says that we should, not welcome into our home anyone who denies the incarnation of Jesus. Okay, well, what's the situation there? What's going on there? How would we apply that into our lives? If I have a plumber who doesn't believe in the Trinity, am I allowed to have him into my house, or is that prohibited? We've got to think through what's the situation or occasion that this letter was written into, and are there any similar situations in our world, in our experience, which might be parallel? But we can't do that until we've understood what the original situation was. And to do that, we sort of need to mind the gap and realize that we're reading a letter, which is an occasional piece of writing.
And you've written your book, 8 case studies. A case study is like, understanding a scenario so that you can apply the understanding you have about the genres. How does your case study method work? I mean, is there one or two you can just mention very briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really dangerous to talk about reading the Bible without actually reading the Bible. So I've tried to show how these principles might work out in practice. Now, I'm an Old Testament person, so I have no business kind of being an expert in the New Testament, but I had a crack at it, and my hope is that at least it will encourage people to sort of take the principles and apply them. So there's examples from New Testament and Old Testament in there. Some of them, like one that I found very interesting to research, was to look at how people read stories. Now you might think, well, that's very simple. A story is a story, but it's not. Because when people read stories, they have an assumption about what you're meant to do with the story. Case in point, there's a bunch of stories in the Old Testament where people do terrible things. Now, are we meant to copy them? Right? What if the person doing the bad thing is one of the great heroes of the Bible, like Abraham, or Sarah? And historically, Christians, particularly during the pre-Civil War period in America, when they were debating slavery or whether we can or can't have slaves, they would look and say, well, Abraham had a slave. Look at this story, Genesis 16. He has Hagar the slave, or Sarah has Hagar the slave, and treats her appallingly. Therefore, go and do likewise. We're allowed to have slaves. But actually, a lot of Christians at the time said, do you know what? I don't think that's how we're meant to read that story. I don't think this is a fairy tale telling us, examples or models for how to live your life, like The Boy Who Cried Wolf or something. I actually think the Bible is telling real kind of gritty family history. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there are no heroes. They're just normal people who are being, caught up in the plans and the purposes and the mercy of a great God. Now, I would say they're very different ways of reading the same story, which lead you to very different outcomes depending on what you think the story is for. Is the Bible a fairy tale, or is it a gritty gritty narrative which tells you the good, the bad, and the ugly? Some people say, well, it doesn't condemn Abraham for having slaves. Well, again, some movies show things without giving a monologue to interpret it. And I think the writers of the Bible are much more like good filmmakers who show, not tell, than they are like sort of over-explained kind of fairy tales who have to, Moses did this, Abraham did this, and that was a very naughty thing. No, I think the Bible actually shows, not tells, much like a movie producer does. But that's a question of genre, and does it make a difference? Well, yeah, in this case, do you think slavery is good and ordained by God, or do you think slavery is a terrible stain on humanity since the fall? I'll leave you and your listeners to decide where they land on that, but it does come down to genre.
Yes, and Andy Judd, the way you communicate, it's beautiful. And anyone who's done some studies in biblical interpretations might be thinking, hey, I wish Andy was my lecturer back in those days when I did some studies in this area. But you've reminded us that there is a gap between us and them today when we talk about today in Bible times. And for listeners who are thinking, you know what, how can I get a hold of a book that might be readable and really authoritative around these sorts of things? You might want to keep an eye out for Andy's book. And it's got an academic-sounding name, Modern Genre Theory. But Andy is a lecturer in Old Testament at Ridley College in Melbourne. So you can imagine he's writing this for students who are being introduced to those principles of how we might interpret the Bible. You can connect with Andy at andyjudd.com. His book is called Modern Genre Theory, an Introduction for Biblical Studies. You'll be able to find that at online booksellers. And you can follow Andy on social media. He's on Blue Sky, on X, and on Instagram. Andy, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us once again today on 2020.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.